Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with a very special guest, Venkat Rao. Venkat, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So Venkat, you are a blogger, founder of Ribbonfarm since 2007. You did your PhD before that, I believe University of Michigan on control theory. I went to Michigan as well. And then you've been blogging for over 12 years. You are an independent consultant. You help executives as sort of a sparring partner. You spent a year at Andreessen Horowitz, and where you published Breaking Smart, which is sort of a expansion of the software is eating the world thesis. And Ribbonfarm is sort of on the cutting edge of culture and organizations, and has explored various different threads and subcultures and helped create some over time. And really early on in the blog sphere, there's a lot of sort of Ribbonfarm spin-outs or inspired blogs that have come out of that. What would you add to my introduction of you just there?
Wow, that's pretty comprehensive. I think you pretty much covered it all. I would add that somewhere in between my PhD and starting a career as a blogger, I did spend about 4 years at Xerox in their innovation group. So that's kind of a chapter in my life that was not very public, but very interesting for me, industrial R&D.
And we're going to get to what you're focused on now in a bit. I'm curious if we just sort of track the crates. You like to say that you sort of your coming out moment was 2009, I believe, with the Gervais principle. But if you look back at sort of the 12 years, plus of writing, what do you think is the contribution that you have made that is going to be most lasting, or the ideas, or what do you think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people might be talking about, or might have spawned other people to build on top of that sort of new insight, way of looking at things?
That's actually a very interesting question, because when you work with basically the realm of pure ideas that don't actually have a direct impact on the world, like, making inventions, you'll enter the history books directly. Being a politician and, getting to be president, you'll enter the history books directly. But when you're working with ideas are in a way sort of disposable, consumable aspect of a particular time and place in history. And usually after a period is over, not many people are very interested in what happened then, even though it might have been a big part of, live culture at that time. And this process interests me where, right now, for example, as part of some of the work I'm doing, I'm learning a lot about the Bloomsbury set. So the Bloomsbury set was a set of writers, poets, intellectuals in 1910s London, and it included Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, T.S. Eliot was on the fringes of that. And if you look at the history of the period, it's very clear that they were kind of like prominent on the cultural scene, so to speak, right? And of course, now, almost 100 years later, we know them by their individual works. So T.S. Eliot is famous as a poet who wrote The Wasteland. You've got Virginia Woolf, who's famous for starting an entire literary genre. So they're known individually. John Maynard Keynes for economics. So that was, I think, very characteristic of the industrial age mode of, intellectual production and working with ideas, where there would be these sort of subterranean, subcultural conversations that were very fertile and people would be working within them. Some small subset of them would kind of pop, write major books, and be remembered in posterity. And then the rest would be forgotten, even though some of them would be very important during that time. And I think of them almost like, in a chemical reaction, there are these nascent species that help the reaction happen, but may or may not be remembered. And one of the interesting things that's happening with intellectual culture and, just working with ideas in general in the age of the internet is the subset of ideas that actually make it into the history books as, coherent bodies of works, like somebody's book, somebody's famous prize-winning contribution to economics. Those things are becoming less and less as a fraction of overall intellectual output, and more is going underground. So I wouldn't actually be surprised if, in answer to your question, my lasting contribution is exactly zero, where everything we've done, everything I've been in conversation with a dozen other people I really enjoy working with at all levels, we are all forgotten. And the only remnant left is some sort of, vague flavor to certain patterns of, I don't know, how management was shaped or how, companies were run. And maybe a couple of phrases and memes that enter the, era without any record of where they came from. Like, to give you an example, I think one of the things I'm most recently well known for is the phrase premium mediocre. And when I look on Twitter now, I see a lot of people using that phrase without actually knowing where it comes from or acknowledging it. And honestly, that's the best feeling in the world, where you get this feeling of being this, backstage, idea conjurer, and it's there, and then you walk away and say, my work here is done. That's kind of what I like. It's like, leave only footprints, take only photographs kind of approach to intellectual culture. And I think the broader philosophical point is, I think that's how it should be. Ideas should be consumables. Ideas should be forgotten the moment they've served their purpose to help people live better lives. And every age should actually revisit the big questions and sort of rethink them for their own needs. And it's actually a little bit of a tragedy if ideas stay on and outlive their utility.
Yeah. And let's, we're going to get into premium mediocre, but if you were writing, maybe narrow the scoping a little bit, if you were writing a Wikipedia page of yourself today and the contributions, you had to sort of, say 3 to 5 sort of either memes or ideas or concepts that you think, oh, no, these are important concepts that I want other people to know about them, or they already do. So premium mediocre might be one of them, maybe something to do with legibility. Like, what are some of the other ones that you think you've either created or helped contextualize for today?
So on the specifics of using Wikipedia as sort of bellwether for that, I should note that I have been hovering on the edge of notability on Wikipedia for several years, where each time I visit, there's a 50-50 chance there will be a notification saying it's been marked for not meeting notability guidelines.
It kind of makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, I totally love that. I love hovering on the edge of notability. That's where I would like to live and die, and I'd like to be forgotten on the edge of notability. It's sort of a lovely...
Because you don't want the costs of fame, basically? Like,
it's not about... I don't really have very strong opinions of fame, but it's like, it's a very liminal space to occupy in culture, and a liminal space is a very fertile space where you're kind of like popping in and out of existence. But yeah, I mean, you covered most of them. I suspect if I'm remembered beyond 10 years, it'll be probably for things like premium mediocre. Maybe the Gervais principle will show up as a footnote in a history of, satirical takes on business history, like the Peter principle, Parkinson's law, Dilbert principle, maybe somewhere in there, the Gervais principle fits. Legibility, yes, I would take credit for popularizing James Scott's ideas quite significantly in the tech subculture, at least. James Carr's finite and infinite games, that's another idea I think I helped evangelize a lot. So, yeah, I mean, it's the usual suspects, exactly what you might think if you kind of browse my writing a little bit. There's like a half a dozen concepts, and they may or may not last.
And what are we're getting into a bunch of those, but looking forward, what are sort of the big ideas that you're excited about now, or spending a lot of time on, or what's potentially the next book about, or some of the questions that you're trying to answer?
So a couple of the big ones, and I think we discussed these earlier in setting up this podcast. Mediocrity is a big one. Another that really interests me is what I call elder blogging, or act 2 thinking. Like, what do you do after you've kind of had an act 1 and you kind of have like a body of work of whatever sort? Maybe you've done a first startup, maybe you've done a first product, maybe you're an academic who's written like 20 papers in an early emerging field. Maybe like me, you're a blogger who's been at it for 12 years and has developed a certain body of work with a few viral hits and a lot of flops along the way. So that's what I think of as an act 1 kind of situation. And then you sit back and say, all right, what next? And I think of that as the Act 2 challenge, and just the intellectual structure of the Act 2 challenge. What type of problem is it? What is it most interesting to do with sort of the second half of your life, so to speak? So that's something that interests me a lot. And of course, the book I'm working on right now is kind of a sequel to my first book, Tempo. So the theme which I'm working on here at the Berggruen Institute, where I'm a fellow for a year. I call it multitemporality. So it's a little bit of a sequel to Tempo in that it's also a book about the nature of time. So the philosophy of time, so to speak. And the basic idea is that we all inhabit our own subjective timeline these days. We don't share one coordinated global sense of time as in the industrial age. It's like if we were all TV channels, there's now 7.5 billion TV channels, and we each live in our own television channel. So that's what I'm working on now.
Let's dive into a few of these ideas. So mediocrity as one big sort of overarching idea, but maybe first you can define premium mediocre, what you think the contribution is there, how it compares to other sort of methods of self-development or productivity, and then we can talk about where you're going with that.
So the two are actually not that related, though they kind of premium mediocre inspired my current sort of bunny trail on mediocrity. But premium mediocre was, my usual shtick of social observation. I keep doing one of these things every couple of years. They have varying degrees of success. So I would say it's social observation with a little bit of an eye to basically making fun of everybody and not letting anybody get away with, a very exalted view of themselves. So it's kind of fun to do these things. And
is the core idea that we need to sort of prove to our parents that we're living better than them, but we don't have more money than them. So it's all like,
it's a theater of, faking more perceived sort of success and progress in life than you're actually experiencing. And it's an artifact of a highly unequal economy with very sort of winner-take-all dynamics in success, traditional careers kind of falling apart, cities becoming unlivably expensive. So, all the usual things that we talk about all over the place. It's a certain social response to that. And it has its funny elements to it, and you kind of have to sit back and take a moment to laugh at these things. And honestly, when I wrote that, it was mainly, an attempt to find a vector of trolling, so to speak, figure out way to make fun of a really large spectrum of things. And as I usually end up doing, what starts out as a troll, I end up finding a couple of deeper ideas within it, and I go long on those things. But I didn't actually expect it to blow up as much as it did. But it seemed to strike a chord, and I think I've gotten the most press and sort of global attention for that of all the things I've ever worked on, even more than the Gervais principle. It's really hilarious to see Twitter people in Kenya writing about premium mediocre, random people in Brazil using the phrase.
Have you thought about a premium mediocre festival or?
It's one of those things that you kind of have to, it's a faddish concept and you have to let it be a faddish concept. Sure. So there are elements of it that I've picked up on and I want to develop more. So I really like the character of Maya Millennial. So the archetype I constructed as a sort of means to explore that social condition, I really like her. And I'm sort of trying to figure out ways to make her an ongoing character who has more adventures in the social world. So we'll see how that goes. So I have some ideas like that, but in general, it's like these things come and go. It'll be there in the environment for another couple of years, then people will forget about it, and that's how it should be.
I'm curious broadly what you think about how you think about the role of humor. One thing I've in a different lens you spent a lot of time just on my feed recently is sort of parody VC. It's sort of like all these channels coming out making fun of venture capitalists, and it's very funny. But humor is also very subversive and really trying to say something. And I guess how do you use humor or think about humor? Like, is there a revolution coming, to overthrow venture capitalists? Like, how should one interpret sort of the rise of parody?
I don't know that there has been much of a rise. It's sort of one of those constants in history. And what actually varies is the level of seriousness and earnestness in a culture. So the humor level kind of stays constant, but people get more or less serious depending on how they see the opportunity for more and serious ways of being in the world, right? So when there's a lot of hope and people see big games they can kind of break into and get into and make something of themselves, then a certain sort of attitude of self-serious and solemn approach to life kind of is on the ascendant. And Silicon Valley was such a space for I would say almost 15 years between the crash of 2000 to about 2016. Silicon Valley had this very self-serious image of this is where the action is. This is where the future of humanity is being invented. And that did lead to a lot of people having a very serious attitude. So I would call that a seriousness bubble. And then, of course, the events in 2016 and after kind of showed us the limits of our ability to script the future as part of the tech world, and we had to kind of take a back seat, and the focus of the theater went somewhere else, and it was not it has not been a very hopeful time, and the energies that previously used to go into being serious and earnest and striving in sort of a Horatio Alger way, they've now gone into like dark, gloomy imaginings and apocalyptic thinking and so forth. So that stuff kind of redistributes itself. But humor is one of those things that I think is almost like constant cosmic background radiation. And depending on your personality type, your fundamental genetics, there's going to be a certain sort of fixed proportion of how much humor you bring to being in the world. And for some people, it's like they can't stop seeing the world in a humorous way to the point that it's actually becoming a liability for them, right? They're the ones who they can't pass up a opportunity for a punchline at a funeral, that kind of personality. People are dying, people are getting shot, there's a war zone on, Hong Kong riots, and they have to make a joke about everything. So that's one extreme. At the other extreme, there's people who just can't lighten up and they'll never have any ability to make jokes. I think I'm somewhere in between there. So I would say have like a 20% default humor reaction to basically everything. Like, it's not something I script or plan. It's like, it's the way I see the world. I mean, I look out the window, I look at something, and 1 out of 5 times I will kind of spot something funny. So it's almost like a filter you have in your basic existence.
Yep. It's also, I wonder, more on a group level, it's like as soon as any group rises in power, it's, even, being woke used to be a pretty serious thing. Now it's sort of a parody. Yeah. They're like easy to make fun of. Like certain things as they rise in powerfulness is just easy to make fun of them.
Yeah, there's different kinds of humor. I think I distinguish. Actually, let me try a 2x2 here. So there's a humor before complexity and a humor after complexity. So the humor before complexity is you're in the world, big intimidating things are happening in the world. You're fundamentally having a scared reaction to the complexity and difficulty of existence. And it's almost a kind of humor that arises out of insecurity and fear. And then there's a certain, edge of cruelty and cynicism and darkness to that, fear spark humor. And then there's the other kind of humor, which you've kind of like lived a little, you've slain a few demons, you've gotten past certain big challenges in your life, and you've kind of made it out the other side alive and with some compassion intact. And the humor that arises out of that life situation, I think it tends to be a little bit more compassionate. And so that's the sort of personal journey angle. And I think there's also a social angle where the more private and playful a kind of humor is. So this is, think of like childlike play or the play of kittens and puppies. That's like, pre-social kind of humor. That's fundamentally much more elemental humor energy. And then there's the sort of socialized form of humor, the kind where it becomes part of play as a social function. I don't know if you're familiar with Huizinga's book, Homo Ludens. So it's a really lovely book about humans and how the play element of culture shapes everything. Like everything is in a certain sense play. But Huizinga's book, the sense of play he's talking about is kind of like how if you go into a courtroom and the judge and the lawyers are arguing, there's a sort of ceremonial play-like quality to it. That's what he's talking about. And humor has that side to it as well. There's a kind of humor that serves a social play function, a ceremonial function, socializing people, cutting out outsiders, cutting people down when they rise above their station, maintaining the social hierarchy. So that's kind of a socially functional humor. And that's not something that I enjoy very much, and I sometimes do it accidentally, but that's not sort of the core of my humor. I like humor more as like a compassionate filter on the world and just a way of seeing in an elemental sense.
Totally. Let's get to mediocrity. What role does it serve for you and what do you want it to serve for others? How is it an alternative to sort of self-help or personal productivity culture? And what questions are you trying to answer around mediocrity in your work?
So mediocrity is an interesting concept if you look at it as a way of describing the world, as opposed to a normative sense of how to be in the world, right? So mediocrity is not an alternative to self-improvement. That's not how I approach it, though it often ends up being that. Mediocrity is a description of the world in almost a tautological sense. In that, if there's a bell curve, most of the people are going to be in the middle. I mean, most of the world, the 7.5 billion people in the world, by definition and construction of how we think about anything at all, most of these people are fundamentally mediocre. And I include myself firmly in the middle of that set. I'm a mediocre person. And it's an interesting engineering challenge to ask, how do you construct the best possible world out of the most mediocre components? Or if you like to get very meta about it, you can ask, how do you construct the most mediocre possible world out of the most mediocre components? And this is actually not as subversive or weird a thought as it might appear at first glance. Like if you look at the history of the industrial world, what you think of as excellence and quality assurance and Lean Six Sigma, all those things we associate with excellence, they're actually in a way mediocrity in disguise. It's like getting to the stage of understanding and knowledge about the way something works, where you can actually have great aggregate outcomes out of, the average component. You don't need excellent people to get excellent outcomes. So the first people who ever flew planes, they had to be, really good at it. They had to be talented in a sensory tactile sense because they were working with temperamental machines that were prototypes and or take space flight, right? Neil Armstrong was a top test pilot and he had like ice water in his veins, as some people describe him. And that's why he was the right person to be flying the lunar module in the Apollo mission. But as things improve, if you're not actually moving to a condition where completely average and mediocre people can participate and create value and help build the world out, you're not actually progressing as a species. So today, basically everybody who graduates with a STEM degree can do a mediocre level of calculus. And there was a time when there were like 5 people in the world who knew how to do calculus. Same thing with relativity. At one point, people said there were like 5 people in the world who understood relativity. Now it's everybody who takes a science degree has a basic understanding of it. And it's part of the way the world works, where things might start out where only exceptional people can do something. And then as they evolve and we understand these things better, middle of the distribution people can work with it. And that's when it starts to actually become useful, because then you can pursue whatever it is at a low enough cost that there's surplus that you can then go beyond and do more with it. So that's the fundamental appeal of mediocrity to me. It's part of the human condition, and it's silly to not understand it and think of it as like a character flaw almost.
In some way, it's sort of like an activism against sort of the idea that you have to be a master at something, or you're nothing if you're not a master at something, or that the goal is mastery.
So being an activist would be a very exceptional thing to do. It's almost like you ever did the, I forget what they call it, acting like a corpse as a kid, where your mom is trying to drag you off and make you do something and you go all floppy and you have to be dragged. It's that kind of almost passive resistance. And it's sort of not activism, maybe we should call it passivism, but basically raising an eyebrow at hustle porn, raising an eyebrow at everybody who says you must, kill yourself and be the best in the world at something. And even if you sort of pull back from it a little bit, like Scott Adams has this heuristic where he says you don't have to be the top 1% in the world at anything, but you should be in the top 25 at 2 things. And that gives you strategic leverage. But you're still thinking in terms of exceptional outcomes and how to kind of beat the crowd. And if you think about it, that presupposes the existence of a crowd to beat. And what is that crowd doing? I mean, are they like chopped liver? Should they all be exterminated and killed? That's kind of a path of thinking where if you don't question yourself, that's how you end up with, genocidal intentions of the superior master race, people with superior genetics should be saved and everybody else should be sent to concentration camps and killed. And some people actually try that, and sometimes it works to some degree. And what do you know? 30 years later, humanity has regressed to the mean right back where it started. And you kind of have to acknowledge this statistical reality of what it means to be part of a species with like 7 billion data points.
Right. But as we become more and more niche, like, can everyone be the best at one thing? Are there enough things? Like, I'm not the best rapper or best venture capitalist, but I'm the best rapping venture capital. Just keep stretching out.
I think there's something very wrong with that way of even thinking about these questions. It's like, what is best? So best, usually when people use it in the sense you're using it, they're thinking almost like, ASPE engineers optimizing a problem. It's like, oh, I'm defining this cost function with these constraints. There's this fitness landscape and there's this lovely peak or bottom of the valley. And I'm going to be there and I'm going to be the top of that hill and I'm going to be happy after that. And that's not how evolution works. That's a sort of deep misunderstanding of adaptation, fitness, evolution. It's a misunderstanding of all those things. It's thinking of evolution as a finite game that you play to win. Mediocrity arises out of thinking of life as an infinite game that you play to figure out how to continue playing, which means you're not always climbing the nearest hill. You are kind of like becoming aware of your situation and just trying to give yourself the most interesting life possible and just continue the game. And when you start thinking that way, the question of, all right, should I pick one super narrow niche where I am the best in the world? It kind of becomes a really ridiculous parody of itself. Like, can you imagine a world like that? 7.5 billion people, each of them is like best at some micro, super nano defined field. And I'm like the super best rapper about technology and software eating the world in the medium of PowerPoint. And hey, 5 other people acknowledge that and 2 people actually watch anything I do. It's kind of a ridiculous endgame, right?
But isn't it sort of like where markets lead us to? I mean, is it increasing, comparative advantage and specialization?
I don't think so. It's there's not actually that much differentiation in a lot of what people do. Like, you and I are having this podcast conversation. I've been on a few podcasts before. You've done dozens before. How different are they all really, right? I mean, should each of them be given a brand name and a, SKU in a MP3 media file library and have like a uniquely differentiated brand? No, the world doesn't work like that. Continuing the game, surviving, does not actually imply everybody has to be special and unique and pop to do that. And that's something actually I think a lot of excellence-focused individual striving type people don't get. That as a social species, there is a sense in which humanity kind of wins or loses the game of evolution as a group. And if you think in this way, where it's like either I personally or this group I'm affiliated with or this tribe or this nation, we will be superlative excellent exemplars of the human species and we will own the future, that's kind of not really how evolution works. If you look at how evolution works in terms of just plain reproductive success and the percentage of biomass of Earth that you occupy, you might argue that algae or insects are much more successful than humans. And it's kind of silly to think that our future depends on identifying what's excellent about some small percentage of us in today's adaptive conditions, codifying that, making it legible, giving away prizes and Nobel Prizes for that, and hoping that by rewarding those people exceptionally, that will somehow ensure our future. This is like wrong on so many levels of understanding of how science and evolution work, how the future works, that it's kind of ridiculous. And the way I like to get at this is, you think the future depends on maybe high IQ and being beautiful in a conventional sense. Maybe that's your thing, and you work hard in a eugenics program for your favorite dictator to make that the future of humanity. And what happens? An asteroid hits the Earth, we get some sort of nuclear winter, and it turns out that the best survivors are really short people who live underground and are really kind of stupid, but are good at finding potatoes underground. I don't know. That's how evolution in practice seems to work, which is the future is uncertain. You don't know what adaptive fitness looks like tomorrow. So codifying what you sort of prize in your status gains today as being a good proxy for what's actually survivable for tomorrow and what's a good way to continue the game, it's kind of like you have to laugh at it. And that's a big part of my Mediocrity project, is basically sitting back and enjoying a good laugh at the expense of that kind of thinking.
And how do you think about the tension between individual identity and group identity? Is it the more you have of one, the less you have of the other? Like, how should we make sense of this? Because I think the mastery mindset is trying to raise the individual identity, like I am special in this way, and this is my expertise.
So this is probably one of the topics where I have personally grown and learned and evolved the most in terms of my views. So yeah, I would say about 15, 20 years ago, I would be something like a naive libertarian where I saw kind of a zero-sum equation between being an individual versus being subsumed into a group and a group identity. And I would say that the people instrumental in kind of changing my mind about that are Hannah Arendt, Ursula Le Guin, a bunch of writers in that vein, Donna Haraway. A lot of people thought of as vaguely feminist, second or third wave feminist, I don't know how to categorize them, environmentally conscious, communitarian thinkers. And the key idea I got from their work is to be whole is to be part. So this is a line Ursula Le Guin uses a lot. To be whole is to be a part. And this gets at something Hannah Arendt also talks about, which is the fullest expression of human nature is only possible in mutuality with other people. So if you go off on your libertarian private island where you have your, little bunker that you've built to survive the apocalypse and all the zombies coming after you, and you've stocked it with like guns and gold and Bitcoin or whatever the hell you're doing, that's a very impoverished way of being human. And that's what Hannah Arendt calls sovereignty as opposed to freedom. And freedom is something that only can be experienced in among a plurality of other people. And this is not a mass in the sense of a mass populist movement following Trump. This is a bunch of people who get to have their own opinion, who get to have sort of a view of the same thing that you're talking about and get to disagree with you. So this is showing up in a conversation, saying things, accepting that other people can disagree with you, not walking away because of that and continuing that conversation. That's mutuality. And Arendt argues that to be fully human is to be part of that process, because if not, you're kind of like cutting off a part of your brain. And this is actually something that really takes a significant amount of maturation for especially people schooled in the sciences to recognize. Conversely, people schooled in the humanities and social sciences, they have the opposite journey to make, which is that they're so immersed in sort of a communal social way of being, and they've never, for example, worked with their hands or soldered a component onto an electronic circuit, that they never actually ever learned their own individual relationship with the universe independently of other people. So both are necessary to have a full experience of human.
When you gave a talk on what Silicon Valley can learn from Hannah Arendt, what were one or two of the core ideas from that talk?
So this was one of the hardest things for me to think through. And what I ended up doing was I made a little slide deck based on her book, The Human Condition. Then I think I wrote an article called How to Make History. So the core of Arendt's book is a little model she has of, think of it as 3 or 4 subspecies of human based on how you sort of exist in the world. So there's the human as a laboring animal. There's the human as the maker, and this maps to Silicon Valley very well. The maker human, homo faber, as she calls it. And then there is what she calls the acting human, the politically conscious acting human who is actually capable of making history. And I think this model is very useful because I see Silicon Valley in particular as having a certain amount of arrested development at the maker level, which is not the most complete way of being human. The sort of ersatz way of evolving beyond being a maker or being a doer is to go into politics. But that's kind of a naive way of thinking about it. It's not a change of societal role that we're talking about. It's more how you relate to people. When you're a maker, what you do is maybe you build a product, you put it out there, people either like it or not. You're communicating with the world at large, not just nature, but other humans, by putting like an artifact out there that sort of exists and degrades and then gets thrown into the landfill maybe. That's being a maker. You're not actually talking. You're not appearing in public in the human race and saying anything. You're putting like a little proxy of yourself that's non-living out there, and that's your presence in the world. And economics is a slight extension of that, which is you're out there in the world, but all you're doing is, trading. You're quoting prices and accepting prices. And that's where another level of arrested development, where, market fundamentalists get stuck. Another level at which maker types get stuck is art. So this is on the humanities side. It's very similar to Silicon Valley in many ways, where artists somehow think that the art should speak for themselves. So they make this piece of art that's kind of like, making an engineering artifact and put it out there and let it speak for itself. So all these are the limit of the maker-doer way of being in the world. And what Arendt, I think her big intellectual contribution was to recognize that there is a fuller, larger way of being in the world, which is actually appear in public and say things and do things that are politically consequential. And you will get that wrong quite often. And then you have to say sorry, and other people have to forgive you. And you have to be part of the dialectic of acting, succeeding, failing, asking for forgiveness, being forgiven, being part of that dialectic, which I think is a fundamentally uncomfortable place for makers to be, because makers and also business people and market people in general, they're very uncomfortable with the idea of actually saying something and being in a dialogue with anybody else who significantly differs from them. They would rather have their work speak for themselves and not appear in public at all. And I think that's something Silicon Valley really needs to learn to get better at.
If there's anything else you could add, edit, or delete from Silicon Valley culture that you think would make it more interesting or effective, what comes to mind?
Add, edit, or delete. I think these things kind of have a life of their own, and asking a question like that is like asking which leg or arm would you amputate. And in a way, if you added, deleted, or subtracted anything, it wouldn't be Silicon Valley, right? It would be something else. So in that sense, the question is a little bit ill-posed, but I think there is something you could say is going on right now that is, in fact, a natural evolution. Some of it is very obvious. For example, the blockchain and cryptocurrency era of technology, it's drawing technological leadership away from the valley proper, and it's spread all over the world. It's sort of the next Silicon Valley is not a place, but sort of a sector that's distributed over the web, right? So there's that kind of like ground level action that's happening that represents evolution in the nature of the beast. There's also, I think, certain amounts of natural evolution happening in the way the capital markets are structured around how Silicon Valley works. There's parts of it that's beginning to look more like Wall Street. The amounts are getting bigger. Private markets, this has been going on for more than a decade. You go longer and longer, and more value capture happens in private markets, and public markets and the S&P and retail investors are increasingly getting shut out of broad-based prosperity and growth. And that's, I think, something Silicon Valley has to reckon with, has to figure out how to create ways for broad-based prosperity to become part of the story again, because that's something that's kind of vanished. Like you just saw that thing by a lot of CEOs, the letter signed by a lot of CEOs, which was, shareholders aren't the only stakeholders, there are other stakeholders. So that's the sort of thing Silicon Valley needs to think about as well, but not in that very, press release kind of way, which was almost a cynical power play between shareholders and managers in that case, but something more genuine along those lines. And I'm not quite sure how to do that. I don't know. Things like Kickstarter kind of did a little bit of that. You were at Product Hunt, right? I mean, so there's a whole layer of Silicon Valley that's kind of inching its way towards broadening the base of the prosperity that Silicon Valley creates. But it's not clear that there are natural paths of growth that'll actually get us there. So it might take some inorganic amputation by external forces to do it. So I don't know what those are, to be honest.
If you were spending a year, you were in Andreessen, what, 2015?
2014, mostly.
If you were there at 2019, 2020, do you think you'd be working on what you just described, or what do you think you'd be researching or working on relative to what you were working on back then, which was sort of the beginnings of the software scene in the world?
So that's a question I've asked myself a lot since I've been trying to write a second season of the essays on my own, and that's gotten delayed. I don't know how I'm going to do that one, but couple of sort of 5 years later perspectives on that. One is, by the way, I've continued talking to Mark and others, so the conversation didn't end there. So I still have like associations with them. I don't think I would do as much different. There would just be a lot more data to make that case I made in the original Breaking Smart essays. And when I look back, it's kind of shocking just how, I don't know, perfectly correct I was in making the predictions. So the two things I got wrong were how quickly it would happen. So I had like a whole, I think 2 or 3 of the essays and a couple of the slides in the slide decks were about how a particular response to software eating the world is going to happen, a reactionary response, and cautioning against that, and we should not do exactly what we ended up doing. So that was a prediction that I hope wouldn't come true, but it didn't. It did. So basically, it was like we were at a fork in the road in about 2015, which was like, path A and path B. And I was kind of like screaming my head off, don't go down road A, go down road B. And the world on the whole picked road A. So that was one thing that I hope wouldn't happen that did. And the other thing is a lot of things that I thought would take 10 years happened in 2, which was the severity and intensity of the political backlash and the social turmoil that followed. I thought we would be where we are today in 2025. So that's kind of my retroactive assessment of what I did then. So what would I do if I were to do the same work today? It would still be software eating the world. I would just have 4 or 5 more years of data. I think the fundamental principles that we applied back then, which came out of conversations with Mark and others, they're still sound. They're exactly the same principles. They just have more data to work with, and they would lead to, I guess, slightly darker conclusions today.
Well, I'm curious as to those. When I hear software eating the world, I sort of equate that with markets eating the world. The world is becoming more market oriented, and there have been sectors that don't want to become market oriented, like healthcare and elements of healthcare, elements of education, but also this idea of like investing in people, like income share agreements. So I guess I sort of call that like the response to markets in the world is sort of like tribalism is eating the like it's anti-marketism. And so how do you sort of think about that battle and think about where markets will go or won't go or should go or shouldn't go? And is it fair to equate software with markets eating the world?
So that's my buddy Taylor Pearson's thesis. So he wrote a blog post on Ribbonfarm, which is really big and comprehensive, which is Markets Eating the World. That was the title of the post. And he made a really solid and comprehensive argument, which in the original draft of the essay I read, he was working more with a blockchain-centric view, but then he expanded the argument to markets in general. And I think that's a very solid version of that argument. And I think, yes, it is a solid argument, and I would say on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I totally believe that argument, and that's the way the future is going to shape up. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I tend to believe that, the reaction is probably stronger than the markets eating the world force. So in a way, I think what's going to happen is both forces are much stronger than people realize. Like the forces making markets more powerful, like price discovery is easier, more and more information is flowing. You have mechanisms like the blockchain to level up the infrastructure. So markets, the fundamental pillars of market ways of solving problems are getting stronger and stronger. The world economy is becoming this giant equilibrium computing machine that's getting better and better at it. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, the opposite of a market, which like you pointed out, is something that's the generalization of tribalism. So some zone of priceless values where it's like, all right, not everything has a price on it. We have this inherent value-based sense of what's infinitely priceless. And there's a certain calculus of pricelessness that operates there. I wrote an article about this, I think 6-7 years ago, called The Economics of Pricelessness, that laid out some, an axiomatic view of how that world works. But that's been getting stronger too, right? I mean, the same exact forces that have made markets stronger have also made the economics of pricelessness much stronger. It's now possible to connect to anybody in the world and create like a priceless bond with them. It's possible to get your 23andMe DNA profile and create a really, really deep genetic genealogy. And if you want to be a racist, you can do it with haplogroups now. So it's both sides of the equation are getting stronger at the same time. And this is like asking, all right, there's a sumo wrestling match going on and you're taking off two weak sumo wrestlers and putting in two really much bigger sumo wrestlers. It's no easier to predict the future now than it was when both forces were much weaker. But I think what we can say is because both forces are stronger, both will end up in forms that we don't necessarily recognize from today's perspective. So markets of the future may not look anything like what we think of as markets of today. Priceless economics things like mass movements may look nothing like, say, the religions of today. And the two might also, they will exist in their separate versions, but they may also exist as in weird combined forms, like smart contracts. What the hell are they? There's some sort of weird mesh of the market-like characteristics of a negotiation and the contract-like characteristics that might be inside a mission-oriented corporation, right? So smart contracts are a sort of mashup of market-like and non-market-like elements in a single instrument. So interesting things are going to happen there.
And how do you make sense of sort of this pricelessness dilemma that, what truly matters in life for a lot of us can't be measured, but we tend to only prioritize the things that can be measured, and it's also getting a lot easier to measure everything, including like how valuable, how good our friendship is. And so how do we sort of get out of this conundrum?
I don't think there is a conundrum. This is kind of a very strong Silicon Valley bias or tech culture bias that everything can and should and will be quantified. I don't think regular people think that way. And when you give them technology that is informed by thinking that way, they don't use it. Like
Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, like have they not impacted how we see people or?
Not really. I mean, you put those measurement type things in there, but that doesn't mean you've eliminated the priceless stuff that goes on. I mean, think about a very sort of discrete, quantified kind of action like blocking somebody or unfriending them on Facebook. At one level, it's a very legible measure of social capital. So the data scientists at Facebook can look at all the data of people friending and unfriending each other and sort of mine the hell out of it. They can look at all the data that preceded that event and say, all right, we can predict when two people will unfriend each other based on this, and this type of interaction. So they can do all that. But if you actually look at what's going on in the relationship, the actual content matters. You can apply all the machine learning you want to sort of try and get a sense of that, try and fingerprint what's happening, and the measures will become perhaps more accurate sort of views of what's going on. But what's going on is not the same as what's being measured. And the danger, and this goes to another of the things I think you mentioned you wanted to talk about, the idea of legibility. So there is a difference between making something legible by measuring it versus killing what is illegible. So just because you're not measuring it does not mean you're killing it. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes you're, cutting down a whole forest and planting a monoculture crop of a single kind of tree, and then it succumbs to a particular disease and the entire forest dies. That's the authoritarian high modernist version of measurement killing illegibility that James Scott talked about. And one of the things that people get wrong about applying legibility and illegibility as a concept is they think it's an artifact of hierarchies and authoritarian regimes. No, this is not true. It's not the case that dictators and imperialists are the ones who face this problem of authoritarian legibilization of things. It can happen in markets. It can happen in very flat kind of situations. So I have this concept I like to think of as seeing like a network, where if you're building, say, a social graph and having this sort of very flat social space where people can interact without authoritarian structures governing how they interact, it might look like you're allowing illegibility to thrive. But at the same time, you are imposing an authoritarian aesthetic on parts of what's going on, which is you present yourself a certain way on Facebook, right? You put up profile pictures. You have a particular set of biographical data you put up there. So that's a legible view of you that's created by the network. So I think of that as seeing like a network. And sometimes, yes, that will kill the illegible and that'll be costly socially. Sometimes it won't. So how do you think about the priceless, illegible stuff going on? I think the important question to ask is, what are you using to look at it? What are you using to make that reality legible to yourself? And are the mechanisms you're using killing what's illegible to the mechanism? And if it's actually killing it, that's a dangerous thing and you should back off. But if it's not killing it, then illegibility has a way of taking care of itself. So that's kind of it's almost a deep optimistic trust in the ability of the priceless stuff to basically take care of itself. And I think it's harder to kill than people think.
A very Silicon Valley or tech framework to building businesses is find information that's not legible and make it legible. And I wonder if there's sort of Red Queen effect where there's sort of a direction of entrepreneurs and market incentives to make everything legible, and then the pricelessness has to move somewhere else along the stack, so to speak, or just is sort of the Red Queen effect there. Does that resonate, or does that not make sense?
I don't know that I would call it a Red Queen effect. I would call it something like externalities, but a more active sense, where it's almost like a quantum measurement effect. In the act of acting on something with sort of a legibilizing technology, you actually change its very nature, right? So you might sort of measure patterns of pedestrian traffic in a big city and say, hey, lots of people are doing this sort of half a mile to 1 mile transit, and it's really not a good thing for cars. So I'm going to put a whole bunch of scooters on the sidewalks. And you do that and you measure everything the scooters are doing and all the users. But then you realize that in the act of introducing that new element into the urban built environment, you've actually changed the urban built environment. And now it's a new thing that you don't understand, right? Because now you have, protesters having fun tossing e-scooters into lakes. So this was, I'm sure you've seen things like this. I used to go for walks on the Seattle waterfront back when I was living in Seattle. And several times I saw the share bikes in totally weird places, like put up trees tossed into the water. And that's what happens. And you've kind of changed the reality in the act of trying to act on it. And therefore, it's not so much that pricelessness has moved to another dimension, as it's more like a waterbed effect. You think you're trying to control something and you push down on one end of a waterbed and something else unintended pops up somewhere else. And some parts of it look like positive externalities, some parts look like negative externalities, and you can model them with economics. And some things are just new social weirdness and entanglement that just aren't even comprehended by economics. And it's just a new thing that's happening now.
Is it, I'm curious, a lot of people do have resentment, markets entering communities, or sort of, people saying transactional behavior ruining sort of this pricelessness that we were talking about. And I wonder if when you improve the tools, like you make a better form of money that takes into account, lack of fungibility between certain, like you make the value measuring tool more emblematic of how we really interpret value, or are those biases that we have built from our being in a zero sum, a world where we sort of, really value scarcity and exclusivity, and should we rise above and see abundance and positive sum? How do you think about that?
Honestly, I'm enough of a tech determinist that I think that particular brand of criticism is mostly noise. Like it's kind of part of the dialectic. There's going to be a response. You do these things as a technologist, you are going to have a response. Is it that important? I believe not, because typically what ends up happening is consumer sentiment and adoption typically trumps anything activists have to say on the matter. And I mean, like take something like, privacy, and you've had privacy activists like screaming bloody murder for like 15, 20 years about how much you're exposing to social networks and so forth. But users don't care. They're perfectly comfortable just sharing as much as they ever did. And even despite everything that's happened in the last few years, the actual response in the broad population of media consumption has been actually very, very tepid. Like a bunch of people have made these sort of very big virtue signaling flounces off the social internet and, gone off doing what I call Walden ponding, or sort of trying to shame corporations into doing better or something. But most people, they've adapted a little bit. Maybe they've gone a little bit into more private fora, like, messengers and Slack instead of Twitter. They've adapted to the toxicity in the environment a little bit by kind of hardening their social behaviors. Like, for example, I now am much more free with my muting and blocking than I used to be. And it's like, I've grown a thick skin in that department. I've gotten better at like just tuning out trolls. So adaptation is happening, and the natural response of people actually using the technology is way more important than anything activists and I don't know, chatterati critical people writing in the New Yorker have to say about it. And ultimately, they don't matter. So I ignore them.
What do you think the sort of sovereign individual, Patry Friedman, Balaji crowd? I'm big fans of, have a lot of respect for it. What do you think they misunderstand, if anything, or where do you differ from them about their views about the charter city movement and governments having less power over time because crypto will sort of separate money and state? Like, when you think about the utopia that they outline, do you have a different utopia? Do you think that they have it? Do you have a different assumption starting point than they do?
I don't traffic in utopias for starters. It's a sort of a consistent theme in all my work and writing is utopian thinking is stupid.
Like high modernism stupid? Like it's like the same errors
it's just not how the world works. Like utopian thinking is a part of the human psyche, and it's almost like, middleware on the way to doing things, but it doesn't actually represent anything real. So it's almost like belief in the afterlife. Like I don't know if you're religious. I'm not. I think most traditional religions are, to be honest, intellectually stupid. So, but belief in an afterlife, belief that there is a heaven and hell that you will get to, it's sort of a social reality. It may not be a literal reality. It may not be something you actually experience, but believing that there is such a thing shapes behaviors in the present, right? People act in certain ways, for better or worse, in the belief that they will end up in heaven or hell. So utopias and dystopias have that kind of forcing function effect on human thinking. But as literal constructs of to believe in or work towards, I think they're ridiculous. That's not something I totally work with. But okay, about the specific one you're talking about, which I think of as the libertarian utopia, basically, it's a sovereign individual.
Yeah.
I would say, first of all, I think they're wrong, and they're wrong in a very interesting way. So I don't waste time on people who are wrong in boring ways. The libertarians are wrong in an interesting way. So it's actually worth thinking about their ideas and taking specific pieces of what they like and sort of playing with them. Where they go wrong, I think, is in underestimating the depth of sociability in human nature, like just how extremely social of a species we are. So we don't organize in groups because we have to. We organize in groups because we want to. And the larger the group and collective we are capable of engineering, given any particular social engineering technology, the larger we'll get to. So if there's a way to create an organization in which all 7.5 billion people on the earth today can have a role and all sort of be part of this huge starship Earth, that's kind of like, a Star Trek starship, we would do that. There's something in humans that actually wants to connect to the largest social realities it can. And this goes back to the Hannah Arendt point I talk about, which Silicon Valley is really obtuse about, which is the fullest experience of being human arises out of being deeply connected to other humans while allowing them to be human. So not, in a mass movement sense. And there is a certain sense in which you cannot experience at the level of, say, a 10-15% hunter-gatherer tribe, which is kind of the libertarian utopian unit. At that level, you cannot experience what it is like to live in a big city like Los Angeles. So that's something I think libertarians in general miss, which is that there's levels and levels of aggregation and social possibility to the human condition. There is nothing like a natural human scale of 10 to 15. It is a complete conceptual error to think that humans are somehow in the Paleolithic era genetically programmed to really love life in 10-15% groups. This is just wrong. Like, you go to a rock concert, there's a stadium full of like 100,000 people or whatever swaying in time to a single beat of music. That's an aggregate that could not exist in Paleolithic times, but people voluntarily go to, and they love the feeling of being connected with that musical vibe to this absolutely huge crowd, right? You go to the Kumbh Mela in India, which is the largest religious festival in the world and the largest human gathering ever. That's, I think, a couple of million people on the banks of the Ganges. Yeah.
At the same time, people also love segregating into like-minded or like like groups segregate together. In Norway, it's awesome.
Yeah, both are true, right? I mean, everybody loves to go off by themselves alone in the forest to meditate for a while maybe, or do something on themselves. We like being in family groups of 3 to 4. We like being in pack groups of like 6 or 7. We like being in little hunter-gatherer groups of 15 to 30. We like being in Dunbar groups of 150 or tribal villages of 500. We like every scale of aggregation.
Right. So why doesn't every group get their own Israel? And not just, religious groups or race groups, but interest groups, or
because I think most people don't want them. Like there's a particular personality that really wants to wall itself off and be the chosen people and kind of like create a social cultural world around themselves. Most people like doing that, I don't know, on weekends as part of a hobby. Like, I don't know, maybe you like cosplaying Marvel Cinematic Universe characters, and on weekends you go hang out with other Marvel fans and dress up as Iron Man. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing in your life, right? So most of us kind of enjoy being part of lots of things. Sometimes we like being part of our little domestic circle. Sometimes we like traveling to a foreign country and being the stranger and completely immersing ourselves in a completely alien world. So yeah, I think it takes a particular kind of personality in a particular situation to actually want the experience of being a chosen people in a promised land. But most people would see that as an impoverished existence and hate it. So I would almost call it something of a psychological disease. Like wanting that is being mentally ill.
Right. And if the obvious question of if you don't believe in utopias or working towards a utopia, does that sort of imply that the status quo is likely to reign if we're not working towards something else?
No, absolutely not. And this is an idea I wrote about a little bit in Breaking Smart, and I've cited since then. So it's, what's his name? Jeffrey Long, I think, the economist. He calls it slouching towards utopia. So if you look at the mechanisms that have driven progress over the last several hundred years, liberal democracies, markets, the idea of individual rights, all these things, there are these little micro mechanisms that create this overall sort of slouchy progress where things are constantly improving, but not towards any specific utopia. So any particular attachment to a given utopia, if you have that, you're going to be disappointed. But things are progressing. And if you're looking for your promised land with your promised people, it'll look like decline to you. But if you don't have such an attachment to a specific utopian vision, you'll kind of see that little stumbles and fits and starts, things are slowly improving. And if you're open-minded enough, you can actually participate in that sense of progress. And I think this is something that is probably one of the greatest achievements of Western civilization in particular in the last several hundred years, which is creating a set of mechanisms that together create this slouching towards utopia arc of history that is not tied to a particular utopian vision of how the world should be. So it's just a force that creates gradual improvement. So I love it. And I think people who don't get this, one of the best things they can do to learn how this stuff works is to read the Discworld novels of Terry Pratchett, because that's a little cartoon sci-fi fantasy universe that runs along those lines and really gets at how it works.
Yeah. Recently, or maybe it was a couple years ago at this point, you made a sort of map / battlegrounds of all the culture wars that are going on in all the different groups from, I don't know, 15 different groups or so. I'm curious how you think that's evolved in the last few years and the culture wars generally. And then also there was this tweet yesterday from Erik Weinstein, which sort of echoed what you said earlier about genetic fitness, like maybe in the future it's small people who can find potatoes. He said, there's typically this idea that there's a market of ideas and the good ideas win, but actually it's to echo your point, genetic, the idea is maximized for fitness win. And he went as far as to say we should discourage the bad ideas that are still fit. And I'm curious just how you make sense of sort of the culture wars, but also sort of the marketplace of ideas and what we should or shouldn't be doing from a, not legal regulatory, but shaming regulatory, if anything. So
I think that chapter of the great weirding is over. So I think the larger dynamic going on is what I've been calling the great weirding, which I learned this later. The original version of the phrase was global weirding, and it was specifically about climate change. I kind of independently came up with the great weirding, where I have a larger bucket of things going on. Climate change, economic transformation, inequality, culture war, everything is in that bucket. So there was a period between Gamergate and Trump getting elected when the culture wars, in the sense that we who are very online think of it, which is, people fighting each other on Twitter, canceling each other, and getting upset about being politically correct, accusing each other of political correctness. That piece of the culture war, I think it's basically over. When it first started and went mainstream, people were kind of shocked by it. People like me, since we have been very online for 15 years, we kind of saw the early stages of that as early as when NRX was blowing up in 2009 to 10 and Gamergate and all those early things. We were kind of spectators or casual participants back then. But when it hit the mainstream around 2015, people were kind of totally weirded out and disoriented by it. And I think since then what's happened is most people have kind of adapted to that existence and kind of adjusted their behavior appropriately. So they know now, for example, that there are certain things you don't say if you don't want to get canceled. And it's like neither a big deal that you turn into your life's mission to stop, nor something that you're stupid enough to provoke needlessly, right? So most people are actually choosing to just go around the culture war as we understand it, rather than go into it and actually fight it. And because that's happening, I think and this is a good thing, the center of gravity of the great weirding has shifted away from the culture war proper to things like, climate action, to things like the trade war. That's like, a follow-on, knock-on consequence. And the culture war itself, it's kind of degenerated into this stalemate between a few factions who are fighting over things that I think a lot of people, including me, have concluded are not worth fighting over. So political correctness, I think it's like a sideshow. It's honestly not important. Like people who get all worked up about it and spend their entire lives and building new websites and intellectual movements around it. It's like, come on, find something better.
That's basically what the intellectual dark web is fighting, right?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I've known a bunch of the people who have since gotten tagged with that label since before that label was there. I've met Erik, I've met Jordan Peterson, I met a couple of others. And as individuals, before this whole thing blew up, I got along well with them. I mean, everybody's kind of doing their own thinking and exploring whatever interests them. And I think labeling it, tagging it, and circling wagons around it and calling it the intellectual dark web was almost a mistake, a bad kind of like an error in judgment in reifying something that would have kind of dissolved more easily if it had been just left alone. So quite apart from any philosophical differences I have with the intellectual dark web and how it sort of flirts with fascism, I think it sort of has dragged on the culture war longer than it needed to go on. And it's still sucking up the energy of a lot of smart people who I think could be doing better things elsewhere. And some people have no choice. They've gotten caught up in it. They've gotten canceled by the left or, hounded by trolls on the right or whatever it is. They have like actual reasons to be upset and trying to get their lives back. But most people who are in it are almost like picking at a scab that they should kind of walk away from. So
what's post this?
These people kind of like go into an end game that nobody gives a shit about, fighting for control of institutions that are not worth fighting over. Like who the hell cares what happens to half a dozen literature departments where people are doing critical theory and whether trans activists or traditional feminists control them.
Did you think progress theory was a good idea, by the way? The Patrick Collison, Tyler Cowen progress studies?
Meh.
Okay.
I was not impressed with that line of thinking at all.
Okay, so you said we're moving beyond the culture war, beyond political correctness. What do we start fighting over next, or what happens after that?
I think you can just let those people fight it out and kind of end their own game. It's a sideshow, ignore it. I think the far more intellectually interesting parts of the great weirding that are shaping up now. What's the future of globalization? What's the future of free trade? How are we actually going to get active on climate action? I think now that the culture wars are kind of like fading a little bit, inequality as a broad theme in discourse is popping back up again. Like if you remember, 2013-14, Thomas Piketty wrote his big book on inequality. And for a while, everybody had to have an opinion on Piketty, right? And somehow we forgot about all that for several years while Trump and the culture wars were happening. And it's back on the radar. And whether you like or dislike Ocasio-Cortez and her gang, they, I think, have done one really valuable thing, which is refocus attention on that, because we never finished that conversation. And that's a conversation that needs to continue and actually land somewhere productive.
And
right?
What's your conclusion on that conversation? Is
What's
it called red herring, or it's just about prosperity, or
No, there's definitely something real there. And this is one of the things that I think I disagree with a lot of, like Mark Andreessen and I have argued about this a little bit. I think inequality is actually, it may be a misframing, but it frames something that's real and actual. And if you ignore it, you risk it blowing up in your face. It is something that requires a policy response. It is something that you have to keep trying to frame better than, just inequality or 1%ers or whatever. The current, let me make it clear, I don't actually like the current frames around the problem. I don't like thinking in terms of Gini indexes and 1% rhetoric and Occupy Wall Street. I think those are all futile and ineffective ways to respond to what it is. But I think if we keep thinking and trying, we will find better frames and we will actually shape good policy responses that inaugurate an interesting new chapter. And to do that, you can look at history a little bit, like, the New Deal in the 1930s, that was a response then. It had its flaws. It had its good elements to it. There were similar things in, say, the 1870s. So yeah, there are historical periods to learn from. So inequality goes up and down as the economy evolves. So it's not a new problem, but this version of it is new, and it requires a very imaginative response that can't just be an uncritical do-over of something from the 1930s. That's where I think people like Ocasio-Cortez fail, which is you take a phrase like the New Deal, you add green to the front, you call it the Green New Deal, and it's this incoherent piece of a policy nightmare that has no hope in hell of even, getting to the starting line, let alone actually having a good impact once it gets there. So that's the wrong path to go down, but it is something we have to continue thinking about.
I'm curious how you think about shared reality tunnels and just the meaning crisis in general, and sort of the pluralism of truth and how we make sense of that.
So that is the topic I'm working on for my book. So it's obviously at an early stage now, and my thoughts are not fully formed as yet. But one analogy I like to use is what happened to the history of television, which is you started with, a single television network. Then you got 3 free-to-air television networks, and there was a big consensus reality created by television, right? So for decades, you had Walter Cronkite telling you that's the way things are. And that's what the peak industrial era was. Everybody was in one big synchronized reality tunnel. Think of it that way. There was a huge mass consensus culture that everybody participated in. And this was not just American. This was global, right? Like Mickey Mouse was part of global reality tunnel. I was growing up in India and I was watching American TV shows as well. So that was then. And of course, at the end of the 80s, what happened was we had the cable revolution, and 3 channels became 300, and at some point it became thousands, and at some point we invented streaming, and you can have on demand. And you have this ability now to create your own television consumption experience that's completely and utterly unlike anybody else's if you choose to. So you might, be sampling. So take my example. I love watching reruns of USA Network shows from 10 years ago. I watch a couple of Korean dramas with my wife. I keep rewatching Futurama. And my particular mix is nothing like what anybody else is watching, but it has some similarities. That's one slice of, I think, a broader phenomenon where any informational element of your environment, you now have complete control to craft as you like. And most of us, of course, aren't going to be imaginative or creative enough to come up with completely unique ways of creating this. So we'll end up, copying each other, forming communities of taste, subcultures. So basically, any group that has enough of a coherent shared consensus to want to maintain a reality and a particular view of the world around them, they can look at the world and all the information streaming out of it and create their own little reality tunnel. So we were talking earlier about chosen people and promised lands. So you can, if you want it, create your own promised land online with its own reality tunnel. You can choose your news sources. You can sort of create your confirmation bias fuel coming at you, and you can create this reality tunnel. And if you do it well, if the narrative is crafted with the right kind of coherence, it becomes almost your own parallel universe with its own timeline. So this is why the connection to temporality comes in, because I think the test of a successful subjective reality tunnel is it feels like its own time zone. So it's not this atemporal chaos or a soup of you're trying a random mix of things. No, there's an actual evolving story to the way you're living. There's sort of a clock and a calendar and an evolutionary path that you're pursuing along with a bunch of people. And it's like you've created your own subjective time zone. So that's what I think of as what's happening to basically the human condition when we have our ability to craft our own realities out of information.
I'm curious how you differentiate, or what's the overlap and difference between truth and meaning. And I sort of this broader idea, I like to think that, religion has been unbundled. There's a community element that's like, Soul Cycle, CrossFit, and lots of other, things that compete over, small groups of people getting meaning over community. And then there's sort of the truth function, and that's both, what is actually happening in the world and has happened historically, and where do I get a sense of meaning from? How do you think about that?
So you're asking two separate and distinct questions. One is epistemology, which is the nature of truth and sort of how you go about finding it and what it means for the way you live. And there, my true north is Philip K. Dick's definition of reality, which is that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it, right? So just because you decide that you don't believe in gravity and step out of a window doesn't mean you're not going to go splat and hit the ground and die, right? So that's the basic principle of reality. But people tend to overstate the strength of that principle. So yes, certain things like gravity have very immediate and sharp consequences if you choose to disbelieve them in very pointed ways. But other things like, socialism or capitalism, maybe you believe socialism is the truth, maybe you believe capitalism is the truth. Are there going to be consequences to holding either belief that are as drastic as jumping out of a window? No. These are things that will take about 50, 70 years to play out. And even then, it'll kind of be up for questioning, right? So if you look at the distribution of things about which you can hold beliefs, there's a narrow category of beliefs where if you choose not to believe them and they continue anyway, they can kill you very quickly. Then there's this wide spectrum of things where you basically can make up your own shit. You can believe all sorts of conspiracy theories. You can believe the earth is flat and it doesn't really hurt you because you're not in any consequential way testing those beliefs. And then there's a third zone of beliefs which are not really matters of empirical testing at all. So they're more in the metaphysics regime. So that's the epistemological axis of the question you're asking. The other axis you're asking about, which is meaning, is it's almost a placeholder word for a huge condition of mass experimentation. So when you use the word meaning, you can put it in scare quotes and say what that actually refers to is, I don't know, hundreds to perhaps thousands of groups of various sizes, some as small as one or two, some as large as Burning Man, which is going on right now, I believe. So all of these groups are running experiments. So it's a condition of massive experiments in answering the question, I guess, what makes life worth living, and why should you choose life over non-life? I think that's a good sort of ground truthing. So connecting the two of truth and meaning, a good place to connect truth and meaning is the question of suicide. So Camus, in his, I forget which work of his, I think it was The Myth of Sisyphus, he said, the only serious philosophical question is that of suicide, right? Every moment that you live, you're by default making a choice of living is better than non-living for the next 1 minute, right? So you can think of that as an extreme way of putting it. And when you take a step back and ask, why am I choosing this? And should I be in fact choosing the other thing and killing myself right now? whatever you come up with as a response to that in some way is your answer to the question of meaning. And that's something that is sort of organic to just choosing to live at all, right? You don't need a lot of social infrastructure or even human notions of culture for that. Animals do this. Like every second of the day, a cat or even a cockroach is choosing life over non-life, right? And at the human level, you have a certain amount of agency in choosing non-life. But some animals do too, right? There's the Pacific octopus, I think, that gives birth. It lays eggs and then just goes in a corner and stops eating and dies. So for that octopus, the meaning of life is lay your eggs, fertilize them, and then go and die. So it's not the case that suicide is only a question of meaning to humans, but it's a good way for humans to think about the question. And what we are doing right now, I think, as a species is recognizing that all the old sources of systematic answers to the question that life is better than death are basically bankrupt now. Like if you used to look to, say, a traditional religion to figure out why you should live rather than not live, that answer kind of looks silly right now. If you go into hedonism or you think it's about media and you think the reason to keep living is that you can keep watching TV for the rest of your life, those are not satisfying answers, right? So people sense, I think, that even though minute to minute the question of suicide isn't top of mind and you may not, it's not like an existential acute crisis where it's like, oh shit, I have no good answer to the question why I'm choosing to live the next 5 minutes, therefore I must kill myself. It's not that kind of existential urgency pressure, but it's this broader sense of minute to minute, I don't need a good answer, but if I don't have an answer at the time scale of years, at the time scale of decades, at the time scale of choosing who to marry or whether or not to have kids, at the time scale of is it worth killing myself trying to build a startup? Should I start my novel? These are questions that rely on what you think your answer to the question of life is better than death is. And we are, I think, in an era of like huge experiments with new attempts at finding the answers. 99.99% of them are going to fail. They're going to end up looking like cartoon caricature attempts at doing these things. 0.01% will succeed. They will be, copied. Variants will be experimented with. And we'll come out of the other end in 15, 20 years with one of two things happening. As a species, we'll have either decided that, the game is worth continuing. The infinite game of humanity as a species is worth continuing. Or we'll have decided that this species is not worth perpetuating and let's just have a bunch of hedonistic fun at the end of the world and let climate change take its course and we all stop having kids and we all grow old and die. So it's that kind of species existential suicide moment that we are in right now. And this is not an abstract point, right? Because you do have an aging population. You do have plummeting birth rates. A lot of people are choosing not to have kids. We don't have kids, and we have no intention of, me and my wife, that is, we have no intention of having kids. And for us, it's the right decision. But I can recognize that at some level, if everybody starts thinking like us, then something very seriously wrong is happening with the species. So I think that's what's happening at the meaning level. And it's kind of coupled to, but orthogonal to the question of truth and the nature of truth.
Yeah. Do you think that's a problem that we should do anything about? Basically, as people get more wealthy and both parents work, there's sort of less desire to have kids.
I would say at a personal level, I'm an antinatalist. I think people who don't want kids should not have kids. And a lot of people should not have kids, period, because they're not capable of bringing children into the world in a way that is actually good for those children. So at the micro level, yeah, I'm strongly in favor of controlling the reproductive instinct, so to speak. So I'm speaking as somebody who's opted out of the gene pool, so to speak. But of course, if the species as a whole starts to choose that option, then at one level, evolution kicks in, right? The future of the human species belongs to those who actually choose to perpetuate it. So if only 1% of people are having children, whoever they are and whatever their reasoning, those are going to be what survive. So if it is short people living underground digging for potatoes, that's going to be the future of humanity.
More precisely, I wonder if it would actually become more genetically fit to have lower IQ if lower IQ people are having more kids?
Perhaps, and that's, I think, one of the age-old questions that keeps eugenicists up at night and has been since Darwin and Spencer. And for, it's been, 170 years or so since Darwin?
Will there ever, eugenics has obviously been killed because of Hitler and lots of other terrible people. Will there ever be a reasonable in the era of CRISPR, right? Like, people will start, modifying diseases and stuff. Will there ever be a credible eugenics that you think you can get behind?
I think there already is and always has been. It's just it's like water, right? I mean, people are choosing all the time how to sort of perpetuate the species. They're choosing that in how they, who they choose to marry, what kind of kids they choose to have, what they choose to train them. So in that sense,
there aren't macro thesis, philosophies that resonate with people, and certainly no policy. Well, I guess except China, but
so there's levels of thinking about eugenics, right? There's the literal authoritarian version of, say, people with green beards are better than people without green beards. Therefore, we will introduce a CRISPR gene into everybody's DNA where people with green beards get killed or something like that. That's the kind of crude science fiction authoritarian understanding of eugenics. But there's, for example, what the elites have always done, which is, marry amongst each other and elite selection. That's a form of sort of social, voluntary opt-in control by classes in determining how their own future is shaped up. Then there's things people do to themselves, which might be like, presumably in the future we'll be able to have designer babies and all kinds of splicing of our own bodies. So I'm sure that's already happening. In fact, I have heard of cases where people are already doing that with surrogacy and donor eggs and things like that. They're trying to actually breed kinds of offspring and futures that they want. So in that sense, eugenics is almost a tautological part of the human condition, in that we don't leave evolution to its own devices. We kind of have opinions and find every possible way we can to act on those opinions, whether it's killing girl babies and choosing to have more male offspring, which has been the practice in Asia for so long, or choosing skin color or selecting for IQ or whatever it is. People do it. I mean, humans are a self-breeding species, and we're not going to stop doing it. And any tool that's available to continue self-breeding, we're going to continue using it.
Going back to meaning, a lot of people also I'm curious how you think meaning in the context of identity is sort of on both poles. There's this, we're talking about sort of the specialization pole earlier of like, hey, I am a, Hispanic technologist who's also Jewish, meaning in my individual identity. And then there's also sort of this pole that's like, I am one with everybody. We are all interconnected. Like, I'm getting rid of my identity. It's like, and then there's also like how identity works on the internet, and will there be pseudonymity or how that will evolve over time? What's your hot take on identity basically, and how that will evolve?
I think everything you just mentioned is part of social identity. So things that arise out of what some people call intersubjectivity, how we are viewed by others and how we appear in culture and society. And I think that's actually ultimately the unimportant kind of identity, and I pretty much ignore it. I think most people, in my sense of the word identity, don't have an identity, because to have an identity at all, you kind of have to have a social death and rebirth, a kind of resurrection moment. It's like, think of Doctor Who. So Doctor Who regenerates after every few years and becomes a new person, right? And that's a metaphor for a lot of what happens to humans through their lives. Like, you go through crisis experiences, you kind of have birth and death of the psyche moments in your life. And until you've had one of those, you're not even born. So it's like religious people talk about, born again Christians and so forth, but it's sort of a more general psychological concept. You're not yet born until you're born again, in a way. So it's your first identity, the starter identity that you're born with, that's completely socially determined and intersubjective, all that. That's the zone of a lot of culture wars, because a lot of people never get beyond that. They never do anything sort of drastic enough in their lives to go through some sort of psychological rebirth where their identity is wiped out and reborn in a new way. Some people never do that. In fact, I would estimate that 60 to 70% of humans never go through enough of a sort of psychic crisis strong enough to experience a rebirth moment. And the culture war is for these people. They're kind of almost the pros of identity, so to speak. And the elite game of identity formation only begins once you've sort of killed yourself and been born again, sort of at a social level, not the suicide thing we were talking about before. And when you think about it that way, the elements of identity that start to matter don't even have social labels. Like you might look at a history of your creative output, like what maybe a company you've built or a big literary work you've done. Having put that out in the world also means you've kind of died and been reborn in the process of creating that. That's an identity that cannot be easily described in social terms, but that's what it means in my terms to have an identity event, where you as a person kind of pop from the social context and your default identity. You're kind of past your starter identity.
Is there a concept or an idea behind we sort of operate under the idea that we have one true self, and if we just listen to it, it'll have the right answers to us, versus the concept of many selves? Or is that itself part of the social identity construct and less interesting?
Yeah, I think the one true self is bullshit. That's a 60s hippie idea that just kind of makes no sense. I'm much more of a constructivist. Your identity is what you make of it through repeated rebirths. And whether it's a single identity or a multiplicity of identities that sort of manifest in different situations, that's sort of almost an artifact of your personal story.
The one true self, you could say, is a segue into mental models. And you talked a bit about, or is a mental model, the poor one. You talked about mental models on the Farnham Street podcast and about how they are basically meant to simplify and provide coherence, because we can't process the world all in one go. There's just too much happening. I'm curious how you think about mental models as it relates to emotions and gut and instinct, and how you what's your framework for when to listen to it versus when to listen to more abstract, intellectual reasoning and sort of interplay and trade-offs between the.
So emotions as an aspect of mental models, I think, is a very exciting area of new thinking and research going on right now. So two sources I would recommend. One is Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's written a wonderful book on the constructivist theory of emotion. Well worth reading. And the other is another of my buddies, Tiago Forte. He's been doing a lot of thinking about it, and he gave a keynote at the recent Refactor camp that we organized. The video will be online soon, but he's actually done a lot of thinking about how to really create your own personal reality through understanding and embodying your emotional life a lot more deeply. So I think we are just at the beginning stages of thinking as deeply about emotional mental models as we already do about cognitive mental models for investment decisions or whatever else we already kind of do.
Naval tweeted the other day, for example, take emotions out of any decision and watch how much better your decision making. And you were talking earlier, like what job should I stay at, who should I be with, etc. Do you think that's bullshit? Do you sympathize with that? Half right?
I think it's wrong, yeah. Emotions are a very deep and true part of who we are as humans. And my response to that is you're kind of like experiencing the human condition in a very reductive way by thinking that way. Like emotions can be a sort of tax or a burden or a compromising force in how you think. But if you come at them another way, they can really, really amplify the depth and richness and quality and imagination of your thinking and decision making. So yeah, you totally have to integrate emotionality into all your thinking as much as you can.
Do you accept the framing, or find this too reductive, that there's sort of feedback loops to help us, survive and reproduce based on societies that looked, the prehistoric societies of what they were sort of built for or wired for over time, and that maps a lot to today, but not entirely on the bounds of survival and reproduction. Road rage being like one example that doesn't really make sense today, and is somewhat overlapping with our happiness, but not always, and thus on a case by case basis. It's always like a false alarm an alarm that that is sometimes wrong, maybe often wrong, but when it's right, it's really right, and so you're really glad it's there, even though it brings a little bit too much. I guess what I said, does that resonate at all, or is that that seems way too reductive, or doesn't make sense in terms of the right? Another way of framing it, you wrote this this post, I think it was the rules, like everyone should have their own rules, and you sort of create almost like a Mad Libs, like rule for this, rule for that, rule for this, based on basically to sort of what were you trying to do there? Train, sort of default responses to different situations so that you would be best prepared for them.
So the post you're talking about, making your own rules, it came out of a bunch of thinking I was doing on a little sort of triangular model I have that's kind of almost a weird personal idiosyncratic model of just how to think about everything. So it's a map of everything. So it's a little triangle, and the three vertices are thinking about physical reality, thinking about private internal reality, and thinking about external social reality. And the inside of the triangle, think of it as getting more and more close to the void, thinking in sort of fragments and memes and unstructured ways. That's the inside of the triangle. And as you go to the center of the triangle, you're in the void. And as you go outside, you get into much more structured and mental model enabled ways of thinking about anything. So that's my map of everything. And I have a scheme for mapping anything you're thinking about on that structure. And the way the sort of biological sort of inspiration for that is something in the brain. So the brain has two processing modes. One is called the default mode network. You just think of it as like open-ended, intuitive, speculative thinking, dreaming, all that stuff is the default mode network. And what used to be called the task-positive network, which is learned skills, habits, and things that are much more in a box. So the outside of my triangular model is task-positive thinking. The inside is default mode thinking. And I think what I was trying to do there with my cues and Mad Libs, as you call it, for creating your own rules is getting in touch with both sides of your sort of cognitive life and where you're thinking and wander. So your thoughts can go all over the place. Some people never go into the inside of the triangle. Some people never go to the outside. Some people stay constantly at one vertex of the triangle, never visiting the others. So the broader purpose of that triangle is to give you a way to become aware of and explore all the thought spaces you are capable of thinking. So it's almost like, all right, this is the map. Go do some thinking on every part of it. Go explore parts of your own ability to think that perhaps you've not explored before. So that was the purpose there. And as far as the actual prompts themselves go, that was almost like a little joke I was kind of making up at kind of the expense of the Jordan Peterson 12 Rules book that was out at the time and doing the rounds. And I was like, all right, I'm going to have some fun with that concept.
Yeah. And another concept related to meaning and truth, or that affects it, or reality certainly, is advertising. And you recently had a tweet that says, advertising got us in this mess, and mark my words, it's going to get us out. What were you saying there? Were you serious there? What does that mean?
That's one of the shitposty things that I often say, and I hope it means something real. And if it turns out to be prescient 3 years later, I can point to something and say, hey, I called it. But I mean, it wasn't 100% shitpost. I think there's something there. Like, one of my thinking heuristics is if everybody is sort of getting all noble and virtuous about something being universally bad, but it's like a huge part of human existence, I'm like, all right, there's a disconnect there, and there's probably something fundamentally core to the human experience that's there that we are missing. And once we recognize what that is, that'll probably be a good thing, and we'll want to, keep it in some form. So that's what I think people are missing when they are kind of universally critical of basically the world's economy becoming a digital economy and the digital economy becoming an advertising economy. They think it's like some kind of descent into dystopian nightmares. I think no, if advertising is such a huge part of the way the world works today, there's something there that's fundamental to who we are. And when we recognize that, it'll actually be the key to interesting futures.
Yeah. You mentioned, you don't traffic in utopian thinking, but do you traffic in dystopian thinking? I mean, I think you tweeted about sort of the evil Ted, or is that more just entertainment rather than?
It's entertainment. I mean, dystopian thinking is fun. Utopian thinking is boring as fuck, but dystopian thinking gives you some of the best entertainment possible. So yeah, I traffic in dystopian thinking for fun.
Some people think that history has inevitability to it. Obviously, there's the Fukuyama end of history argument. Robert Wright wrote this book called Non-Zero, which is basically saying, if you look at history, both culturally and biologically, it's more or less or obvious that it's it's an increasing set of increasingly complex interactions over time, non-zero sum games as opposed to zero sum games, and that our only options are to either prosper in increasing complexity or World War III, die in nuclear war. Do you accept sort of or bristle any sort of inevitability? Was it inevitable that we would beat the Nazis, etc.?
So I'm what you could call sort of a statistical historicist. As in, I'm not a historicist in the sense of believing that there's a fundamental universal principle driving history in a certain way. I think it is an empirical matter of fact that the arc of history has a certain shape and tendency to it, but I don't think there's any fundamental reason it necessarily has to be that way. In other words, I think it's like, have you heard of the anthropic principle, which is a very cute little thought experiment of around why there is life on Earth or in this universe. So those are the weak and strong anthropic principles. And the argument basically goes that there is life because only if there was life would somebody be around to even ask the question, what is life? So something like that. It's almost like or if you ask, why are conditions on Earth? So that was the, I think, weak anthropic principle. And the strong one is, how come conditions on Earth are perfect for complex human intelligent life to evolve and invent, spacecraft and stuff? The answer is kind of like tautologically obvious, because if it wasn't, there wouldn't be an advanced species around asking that question, right? So for that to happen, there's almost a statistical tautology at work there. And I think that's true of, in a softer way, of all historicist thinking. I mean, of course, history is going to look like a non-zero sum increasing complexity game of sophisticated evolution, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't be here asking why it is that way, right? So there's an anthropic principle question. So in that sense, it's a trite question, but I think there's also a deeper question that you can ask, which is, all right, what are the statistics of that? Under what conditions can it continue? Can it actually sort of stabilize itself? Can it find a broader base of like robustifying itself, or is it necessarily a random experiment and the asteroid hits us and we all die? So yeah, there's interesting places to go from that starting point.
One thing you read a lot about is status, or I've written a bit about. There's this concept I saw on the internet, in some dark corner of the internet, called bio-Leninism, which basically compares sort of it says that Leninism was about rich people promising poor people status by raising their economic situation, and that sort of it backfired. It is in Russia. It backfired because that's not a long-term strategy, because people rise up or rise down and thus are not loyal. And also the West as a counter to that was just more appealing. And that bio-Leninism today is a similar promise between the higher status and the lower status, by saying, hey, vote for me, I'll raise your status. But it's a pact instead between rich or poor, between sort of, white people of a certain disposition and different races and genders. And really, it's a mutual pact to increase everyone's status against the even richest white people. Is there interesting truth there, or is that totally reductive and wrong?
I think there's an element of that that's basically conventional wisdom amongst sociologists and anthropologists. So there's this notion called hypodescent that you can look up. I think there's papers and books on it. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, throughout history, there have been social hierarchies, and there have been movements up and down ladders of caste and race and things like that. So part of it is basically just conventional subject matter. The internet has this way of taking things that are kind of boring, conventional, scholarly wisdom and putting this sort of radical conspiratorial spin on them and sort of getting all worked up about it. So I think part of what you're describing sounds to me like you could probably find several chapters in lots of anthropology and sociology textbooks that talk about this in a fairly boring way. So that part, I suspect there's some substance to it. Other parts of it kind of sound like, I don't know, random internet crackpottery. And I think that's generally true of most of these things you find in the wild in the internet. There's like a small element of, I don't know, randomly rediscovered autodidact truth. That's how I think of it. Like there's probably some corner of academia where like people have been toiling in obscurity for several generations to come up with like very boring papers and books nobody reads about something. and somebody online on Reddit or somewhere has an insight that gets at like 10% of that, gets all excited about it, and then proceeds to build this huge crackpot theory on top of it. And then that gets really popular. And then somebody goes and discovers the scholarly literature. And then you have a nice bit of an internet confusion. So that dynamic repeats itself over and over again. What you're describing sounds like it's in that category, like 10% probably something academics already think about that way, and 90% crackpottery that gets people worked up.
Speaking of crackpottery that gets people worked up, what do you think is the biggest thing the neo-reactionary movement misunderstands or misses?
I think they overestimate the value a typical human places on the notion of sacredness. So the instinct towards sacredness is there in humans. Like people kind of have a sense of what is sacred and respond in certain ways to the sense of being in the presence of the sacred. And to some people, it's a very, very strong feeling. And from it, all sorts of things like, a strong purity drive or a strong conservative drive or a strong sort of racial purity drive, all sorts of responses emerge from having a strong sensitivity to sacredness. But I think the median human is not actually that sensitive to notions of the sacred. And the median human is kind of this half-ass, mediocre person who's like kind of casually going through the motions around things that are sacred to a core group of people. This is one element of Zizek's, Slavoj Zizek's thinking that I really like, which is he's got this essay, I think it's something like cynicism as ideology or something like that. I'll have to look it up. But the idea being that there's this kind of person who thinks that the world comprises this mass of people who are laboring in the darkness and need to be enlightened. And once they're enlightened, they will see the truth and sort of worship the right sacred thing, and the world will be a better place. So that's kind of a typical way sacredness-driven people think. And Zizek's point is that's not how ideology works. That's kind of how ideologues think ideology works. But the way it actually works is most people kind of just go through the motions and make cynical little jokes around the water cooler about whatever the prevailing ideology is. And that culture of cynicism around a core of sacredness is how ideology actually exists in practice and evolves. And it doesn't matter what ideology you're talking about. All ideologies work like this. And any political imagination that's based fundamentally on taking the sacred seriously kind of flounders against the sort of rock of this human reality that humans are fundamentally not that serious about things that ideologues think should be taken seriously. So that's I think, where they fundamentally kind of go wrong in all their analysis.
So what were you trying to do in the unflattening Hobbes piece? What was sort of the main takeaway from there?
If you look at history and sort of anarchic conflict, political scientists really love the notion of anarchy as a starting point for institution building. So that's where the Hobbesian state of nature thought experiment comes from, right? There's this notional state where it's a war of all against all. And at some point, some larger structures start to emerge. People band together. Maybe they form roving gangs, and then they are like roving bandit states, and the stationary bandits. And they have this sort of almost spherical cow idea of how political history evolves. And there's some interesting thought experiment like truths to it. The show Deadwood, for example, is a really good fictional representation of humans evolving from the state of nature to an advanced society. And when you try and play this video in reverse, you get a particular kind of dystopian anarchist utopia. So, by the way, a lot of dystopias are actually utopias in disguise because the people who are after those dystopias love the idea of it. So a lot of anarchic Hobbesian conflict scenarios are actually utopias in disguise preferred by people who would love to be in a state of anarchy fighting with each other all the time. And that's the traditional understanding of what Hobbesian conflict is. And what I was getting at in the unflattening Hobbes piece is that it doesn't have to be that way. You can have this condition of war of all against all that is not, in fact, an anarchy. You can have a stable social order. You can have a built environment. You can have civilization. You can have the United Nations, nation states. You can have corporations, all sorts of things. And you can still have a condition where it's a war of all against all at all levels. And this is unflattening because instead of this flat structure where it's all against all at one level, it's more a hierarchy of you and so there's an Arab saying, I believe it's like you against me, you and me against our cousin, you and me and my cousin against those people over there. So it's like this bootstrapped hierarchy of conflict levels, and that's the tribal version of the hierarchy, which is much simpler, but you can have this societal version of this hierarchy. And one of the things I was exploring in that piece is, are we actually entering that kind of Hobbesian conflict condition? And that's, by the way, what I was going back to something we were talking about earlier of the center of gravity of the great weirding, moving away from the culture war zone to other places. You can think of that as a cancerous conflict condition metastasizing into the broader body politic. And I think that's a future worth speculatively thinking about. It's a dystopian, so it's kind of fun to think about simply because it's dystopian. But I think it gets at certain things that are happening.
If you didn't say already, is there a place where you see the great weirding moving to? Like, we're in the culture wars, now it's X?
Climate action. So climate is turning into going from important to urgent and like a slow developing crisis to a really falling off a cliff crisis much faster than people thought it would. So I think that's going to be, great weirding equals climate change in the next decade.
And what's that going to look like? Is it going to be a continued war between people who think it's overstated and people who, or is it going to become?
That's over. That's over. The climate denial movement is basically a sideshow now. It doesn't matter. We are already in the phase of the game entirely belongs to people who believe it's happening. And the question is, what do they think they need to do about it? So, what you call climate hawks versus climate doves, people who believe nukes are the nuclear power is part of the solution versus not, people who think that the coming huge refugee crisis from, climate change zones to safer parts of the world, how to deal with it, whether to build walls or to build networks where, migration can be safely handled. So it's come down to that level of tactical detail almost.
There's this saying, we have godlike technology, Paleolithic emotions, and medieval institutions. And some people think that the way for progress is to improve the institutions, i.e. the incentives. And so it's a lot of the crypto community is excited about better aligning incentives so that people don't have to change, but that their actions will because of these incentives. And then there's other parts, Christianity and other sort of cultural movements that are trying to code better people through different practices and approaches and mental models and perspectives. Do you have a say on what's more effective or what we should focus on, or is it obviously both? And
so this actually connects to the meaning conversation we were having earlier about we are in an era of widespread experimentation in ways of making meaning. And remember what I said there, which is experimentation in making meaning is really experimentation in getting better answers to the question of suicide. Like, should we die or should we live? And that question, it becomes more important, urgent, and acute when there are big crises like climate action going on. Like asking, should I live or should I die, when you're fundamentally comfortable and nothing big is being disrupted in the environment, that might be a question of like, do I have a meaningful life? Am I doing meaningful work? Do I have good relationships with people? But asking the same question, should I live or should I not live in a condition of extreme crisis? Maybe there's flooding. Maybe there's refugees coming into your town. Maybe your whole city has been overrun with like people in slum-like tents. Maybe there's starving, dying people. Everything is miserable. The only things around that it's possible to do is like, try and help the suffering. There's not much fun to be had. Maybe Hollywood is dead and there's no movies to escape to. In that condition, do you choose to live or die? Is it still meaningful to seek to continue to live when all you have available to you, raw material for making meaning is solving really hard crisis problems and alleviating suffering? If that's what you have to face with, is it still worth living, right? So the questions of meaning making, they're becoming more urgent now, in part because old answers have failed. So going to a quote of, medieval institutions, value emotions and stuff like that. So old ways of meaning making are failing. But the other part is the urgent pressure to actually come up with answers that are solid enough and robust enough to get us through what is going to be a really tough time for a lot of people in lots of parts of the world. There is, for a lot of people in the next 15, 20 years, life is not going to be a lot of fun. And a lot of them are, in fact, going to choose to not live. Like you see this in the wake of every sort of collapsing society. Like when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a huge spike in suicide rates amongst middle-aged males. You're seeing that in the US today as the US power is declining. So this is not an abstract question. When there is a crisis, when survival pressures get extreme, when old ways of meaning making fail, then people look for new ways, they experiment with new ways. Most of them fail. The result of that failure is choosing not to live. So you will see a spike in suicide rates. And that's kind of just the harsh near-term future we have to get through.
And does China rise as the US collapses, or just becomes more like Britain or something in terms of loses power?
I think that depends very strongly on the choices US political leadership makes in the next 5 to 10 years. Because I think most of the times politics is irrelevant and the world kind of just does whatever without reference to what political leaders are thinking. But there are times and places when how politicians respond to realities actually matters. So at one point, China decided to retreat from the world and burn all its boats, as the mythology goes, and it gave up its stance at the Industrial Revolution, and Europe took the lead, right? And whoever was the Chinese emperor at that time made that choice. Britain was starting its decline sometime in the 1850s, and it was a very slow, long, century-long decline. And after the end of World War II, they basically became a vassal state to the United States. And now they're in Brexit, which is almost the end game of the British Empire. So what British leaders choose now actually matters. Same thing with US leadership now. Like Trump is trying to hereby order US corporations to do certain things. How they respond will actually determine what happens to the US in the next 15, 20 years. So whether it's a zero-sum game where the rise of China means the fall of US, or it's a non-zero-sum game where the world economy benefits from having like two large innovative superpowers, that's actually a choice that leaders in both countries are making right now.
If legibility is to capitalism, the intense pressure to keep making more things legible, what blank is to meaning or fulfillment or happiness?
I think it's probably hedonism. So working at the level of the pleasure principle and just seeking to to maximize hedonistic pleasure from moment to moment. And to relate that to something I was talking about earlier, that maps to the lowest level on the Hannah Arendt hierarchy. So hedonistic bliss is the only kind of happiness available if you're at the laboring level of the human condition. And for higher forms, you kind of have to level up from there.
And I guess the only question I have on top of that is legibility to capital seems to work. Like it seems to be a foolproof way to make money is to keep making things legible that are in people's heads. Whereas unclear that hedonism leads to, or unbridled hedonism leads to the meaning or fulfillment that people are seeking.
No, it doesn't. Just like trying to make things legible does not necessarily create wealth, pursuing hedonism does not necessarily create happiness. Like it's one of the things that are somewhere part of the puzzle. Pleasurable things are pleasurable and they should be part of your equation. But if you reductively focus on just that, chances are you're not going to go anywhere beyond that.
Right. And what does capitalism need beyond legibility?
I think mainly leaving illegibility alone. Like it's possible to make certain things legible without trying to kill what's illegible around that legible thing. And so long as you have that sort of laissez-faire attitude towards what you make legible versus what you kind of leave alone to do its own thing, things kind of take care of themselves. But if you try to kill whatever you don't understand, that's when things get problematic.
Totally. In closing, talk about the elder blogging you were talking about earlier, or Act 2. What is sort of the idea behind Act 1, Act 2, and what does that look like for you?
I don't know. I'm still figuring it out. It's like one of the responses when I tend to be a grumpy old man on Twitter sometimes, and I complain about this stuff. And when I say things like, "Oh, I'm slowing down. It's harder for me to get good ideas," and blah blah blah, people often respond with what I think are an uninteresting kind of suggestion, which is, throw it all away and start again, self-disrupt. And I think those are the wrong answers because they are a way to have a second Act 1, which is not the same thing as having a first Act 2. So I think it's actually an interesting challenge to look at. I'm going to be 45 this year. So look at, 45 years of life and say, all right, for better or worse, I've lived a certain life and 25 years as an adult. And there's a certain sort of pile of shit in my life that has to do with that. Some of it is good shit, some of it is bad shit, but there is stuff. There's 25 years worth of stuff. And you can choose to respond to it one of two ways. You can sort of wipe the slate clean and try to pretend you're 20 again and kind of have a rerun and a do-over of Act 1, which I think is fundamentally an uninteresting thing to do. Or you can say, all right, here I am. It is what it is. Where do I go from here? What are the interesting places I can get to by virtue of being where I am now? And that's, I think, the essence of the Act 2 challenge. And it's something I find interesting to think about. Like, I don't want to do over of my life from 20 to 45. I want a first instance of my life from 45 to 70 or whatever it is.
This has been a fantastic episode, Venkat Rao. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast. For people who want to go deeper into your work, they could follow you at VGR. They could check out Ribbonfarm. Where else might you point them?
I have email list on consulting that is called Art of Gig. And I have Breaking Smart, which is where I do short podcasts, 10, 15-minute podcasts every week. So yeah, I'm all over the place.
Fantastic. Venkat, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.